So I think we'll jump in today to the topic, making the right decision. Something I think about a lot is, Buddhism being such like an existential spiritual tradition, life and death, impermanence, suffering, liberation. I think about like, all right, but how do I like make a decision of whether I apply for this job or stay at my current job, or, stay in this relationship or break up with this person? Is it my shortcomings that are the problem, or their shortcomings that don't work for me, right? And so I wanted to maybe give you the right answer. I'm glad you are already laughing, okay. So making the right decision, it's going to be mostly a talk on the Eightfold Path factors of wise view and wise intention, which I view as aspects of the Buddhist teaching that help guide us. Sometimes the Eightfold Path is called a map, right? And so the wisdom is what you get when you're navigating the land, in this metaphor. It's not the map itself, right? Like going on a hike isn't fun because you read a map the whole time. It's fun because you were actually walking the trail and you were present in the moment. And so the Dharma is kind of like a map, and view and intention is a place where we can focus on our process of making a decision. So hopefully this will resonate in some ways as we go through it. I want to start by talking about mindfulness, because I think it's one of the unique things about this path, is the Buddha gave us also a map for studying or investigating our direct moment-to-moment experience. And in the Buddha's own process, his process of examining the moment-to-moment experience, he discovered that every observable aspect of moment-to-moment experience is transient, is ever-changing, is impermanent. So one of the Buddha's discoveries is when he sat down and looked at all that he could observe in the present moment, everything was in flux. Nothing was static. So in meditation, we look at impermanence in this microcosm, right? We're really interested in impermanence at the level of what I would call sensory experience. And this is kind of unique. Like when I'm working my job and engaged in my daily life, I'm not always attuned to the level of sound and sight and smell and taste. I'm not always attuned to bodily sensation. I'm not always attuned to the pleasant or unpleasant or neutral quality or impression of the moment. I'm not always attuned to the mind state, the attitude of the mind in the moment. I'm not always attuned to the thoughts that are occurring in the moment. And so with meditation, when we sit down and we see the impermanence of sight and smell and taste and sound and sensation and feeling and emotion and thought. And we, as human beings, whether you've been a meditator or not, also notice impermanence in the more meso and macro areas of our lives, right? We've all been through job changes. We've all been through breakups. Some of us have had children. All of us either have or will experience the loss of loved ones. So there's impermanence in our families and in our jobs, in our relationships, in our communities. And of course, there's impermanence on the macro scale. There's, election cycles and different trends and technology changing all the time. So we can all agree that every observable aspect of life is infused with impermanence, right? Okay, I see a lot of heads nodding. And so we have a piece of the puzzle that the Buddha is setting up as the first factor of the Eightfold Path, which is wise view. And first I want to say a little bit of something about wise view, because it's a little bit of a tricky thing to tackle. with some of our conditioning around what a view is. And so when I first thought, okay, first factor, wise view, I thought, okay, the Buddha is going to tell us like how we should view things, right? It's going to be kind of like the Buddha's understanding of how things work. And that's kind of true, but it's kind of not. And the devil's in the details. It's actually kind of important why that's maybe not entirely true, that the Buddha is going to tell us how to view things, is because the Buddha is saying that how you view things is the difference between your freedom and your suffering. He's not saying that you should view things a certain way. He's saying you should pay intimate attention to the way that you view the moment that you're in. And so in this way, view isn't always a belief. Like, I can believe in kindness, but I'm not always looking through the lens of kindness. Sometimes I'm being an asshole. But I believe in kindness. I believe it's important to be kind. I really do. And I've sat in meditation, and I even believe in my heart of hearts. Like, I believe down in here. But I forget to be kind, right? I lose the lens. And so wise view is actually about cultivating a lens. It's about how do we kind of consistently monitor? How do we stay in touch with the lens in which we're viewing the present moment? Does that make sense? So it's kind of a trippy thing, and a lot of Eastern traditions do this, where they're more interested in the process by which, in this case, consciousness or reality or perception, whatever you want to call it, is being constructed rather than beliefs. So we all have a belief in impermanence. At least I do. I mean, that's been my experience. Life changes. I have a belief in it. I've also observed it. I've observed impermanence. And this second type, this observational type, is the type we're really interested in. And so for me, if life is pervaded or infused with change, this means, and this is another lens the Buddha offers, that there is an inherent vulnerability, that there is a precarious nature to life. And I looked up the word precarious because I hear Dharma teachers use it all the time, and I know what it means, but I wouldn't say that word, so I looked it up. And precarious has a really great definition. It means not securely held in position. And so one of the lenses that Buddha offers is he says, if you look at your direct moment-to-moment experience, do you see it as a transient experience? And as you look at this transient experience, do you notice it has a precarious nature? It's not securely held in position. Because it's impermanent, it's vulnerable. You can't predict the next moment. You can't control the next moment. All of these kind of impermanent variables that are occurring in our lives are happening, and we can engage with them, but they're largely happening outside of our control, ultimately. Right? And so what happens when we're vulnerable? And he asks us to examine, to look. Well, when you're experiencing this vulnerability of not quite being in control, do you notice reactivity arising? Do you notice an attempt to fix things? Do you notice an attempt to figure things out? Do you notice an attempt to try to control things? Do you notice a fear driving the behavior? He calls this word, this reactivity, tanha. And tanha means thirst. And when I first heard this, I was like, all right, this kind of like craving. And being a person in recovery from addiction, I was already sold. I was like, yes, a lot of my life is just driven by craving. But I don't think that's true in the same way for everybody. I think all of us could probably find a degree of that in our lives. But I don't think it's just talking about craving for sense pleasure. I think it's more talking about this basic feeling of restlessness that we feel inside from the reality that we are very vulnerable, spinning through a world that's not within our control. And this internal restlessness that we feel inside. You know that feeling? So that's the feeling that resonated with me when I heard the Buddhist teaching. Is why is it so hard actually to sit with myself for 30 minutes? And not as a judgment, but shouldn't that be easy? I've kind of been in this body and this life for 37 years now. Why is it so hard to do nothing for 30 minutes and just to sit? And I'll give you a really helpful tool, is whatever you're feeling inside that makes it hard, that's tanha. And we don't have to say it's craving, we don't have to say and we don't have to define what it is. It's that inner feeling that makes it hard to sit quietly with ourselves. It's the mind saying, let me think of another plan. And then you saying, hey mind, how about the breath? And the mind says, I breathed a lot of breaths and they're not that interesting. And that's with experience, right? I mean, that's getting somewhere. When I first came in, it was, is someone going to smack me over the head with a bat while I have my eyes closed? It was a level of not feeling safe in a room of other people with my eyes closed. And we can look at all the reasons why it would make sense. We can talk about trauma. I'm a trauma therapist, and I want to validate all of that. But also, I think it's the human experience. That there is this restlessness of sitting with ourselves. There's this fear. There's this suspicion of one another. There's this, competition with one another. The list goes on and on, in my experience. So we live, if you observe, maybe you found that we live in a moment-to-moment experience that's constantly changing. There is a vulnerability. The Buddha uses the word dukkha, which means friction, basically. There's a friction to living in a world of impermanence. And that this reactivity arises to try to find some place that's securely held when life's nature is precarious, which means not securely held. And after the Buddha's awakening, it's really interesting if you get into the nerdy words of all the stuff, the discourses and the suttas. The Buddha has this sutta called the Noble Quest. I think I talked about it last time I was here. And in one part of it, he says, basically, this is going to be really hard for people to practice because no one wants to really sit with themselves. And he wasn't doing it judgmentally. He's just this was really hard. He woke up, was completely enlightened, and was that was hard. And he was I don't know if anyone's going to want to do this. I almost died. And he says, it's hard because we kind of delight and revel in our place. He says, we look for a securely held place. We look for something to grasp onto. He says when what we're waking up to is this, he calls it conditionality or conditioned arising, which means this experience that's not bound to a place, a groundless experience. And so I see a lot of heads now, I think actually you know what this feeling is. And it doesn't matter if you're Buddhist or not. I don't think it's anything special to Buddhism. But I think we all know this experience of that groundlessness. And so my challenge is not my challenge that I'm going to undertake, but the tricky thing, the thing that's been hard for me, has been how do I engage with life knowing that I don't quite know how things are going to work out. And the Buddha tried two paths. He tried a path of trying to make life predictable and secure and comfortable, and that didn't work out. And a lot of us are familiar with that. But I also want to give a shout out because I've been of this other path as well. He tried this other path of trying a kind of complete disengagement from life. Well, if everything's impermanent, if I don't have control, then I don't have any agency. And then the problem is that everyone else is running around doing all this stupid, engaging in life kind of stuff, and they're all just going to die in the end, right? And I see a couple heads nodding for the maybe more depressive, nihilist type of minds. Yeah, and he said, oh, this is a dead end too. He said, if you try to engage in life in a way to seek comfort, you're going to fail. And if you try to disengage, thinking you can somehow get out of it all, that also doesn't work. There's no escape, is what he found. And so maybe we can try. We can keep trying. But sometimes for some of us, we get to this place, Bhikkhu Bodhi says, with all escape routes blocked, we're forced to find a way to bring our disquietude to an end. So if I can't find something that's going to make me finally quell that restless feeling inside, but I also can't just disengage from life and withdraw from life and get that to go away either, then I'm forced to find another way, right? And this is what the Buddha called the middle path. And for simplicity, I'd say, and these are just words, I think that the middle path is engaged non-attachment. We also have this word upekkha, which means equanimity, which means being able to fully be present for life and all of its impermanence and all of its vulnerability, and to fully engage in decision-making, to engage in life fully while also not having control over the outcomes. And that, I feel, is a very powerful place. And it's certainly been a lot more sustainable than my depressed place. So, I just didn't find it in the comfort place. I was pretty bad at seeking comfort. It ended pretty quickly for me. And it also didn't work in this kind of disengaged place. So how do we engage with life knowing we don't quite know how things will work out? And how do we make the right decision? What is the right decision? So the Buddha offers this other aspect of wise view. So he talks about impermanence and really the Four Noble Truths. So he talks about this vulnerability and the reactivity that arises. And then this other part of wise view is about karma. And as I had to give a disclaimer about view and what it means in the Buddhist context, I kind of have to do the same for karma. Because we all have this kind of pop culture understanding of karma, which is totally fine. But one important thing to know is karma was an idea that existed far before the Buddha was born. So he was using an idea, but he was drastically changing the meaning of the idea. And so when people study the Buddhist teaching on karma, it's really helpful to know that it's not that he said karma exists, that's the point. It's what he said that was different than the people before him. And so what he said about karma was, karma is not this metaphysical thing, like you do good and you'll get good later. He says karma is the law of cause and effect. He says whatever you practice through thought, through speech, through behavior, grows as like a current of a river. And so if you worry and you follow the worrying thoughts and you act on the worrying thoughts, you're going to feel stress, you're going to react out of stress, and you're going to create more worrying circumstances that you can worry about later. Right? So it's not this metaphysical thing, it's actually this kind of very, I would say, empirical cause and effect between what you think about and the environment you end up living in. Because your mind is such a big part of your environment. I don't mean your external, I mean your internal environment. Right? And remember, this all comes from view. So the Buddha is only interested in the mind. He actually has no opinions about, life outside of the mind. He makes no metaphysical claims. When people ask him about afterlives and all that stuff, he basically ignores the question. He's only interested in the mind and how your mind constructs a reality, and how whatever you practice starting in your mind gets stronger. So before there's an action, before I make a decision, there's an impulse. There's a bodily response. There's sometimes a conscious impulse, like a voice in my head that says, what should I do here? And sometimes there's just like a reflex. But before I act, there's some internal process, and we would just call this mind. And mind doesn't have to just mean thought. In Buddhism, mind means, it includes impulse. So when there's an impulse with mindfulness, we can notice these impulses. And when you meditate, this is what you're doing. Part of what you're doing for 30 minutes, the thought says, you know what would be way better than sitting on your butt for 30 minutes? Going and doing this other thing that's more fun. And you say, no, I'm going to notice that impulse, and I'm going to let it come and go, and I'm going to still sit here. That's a really powerful thing, actually. Like, so many of my problems have come from just not wanting to sit a moment longer. You know what I mean? Like, so much of my problem in my life has been not wanting to sit a moment longer. And there's this blessing of, and I've noticed this even at work this week, like being really ticked off. I won't say who towards, but not our employees. Okay, this is the landlord. And wanting to react and just being like, you know what? I've learned that if I just mouth off and say some shit, I'm probably going to regret it. It's probably not going to help. So being able to sit a moment longer. And so with mindfulness, we sit with these impulses, and not only do we let them come and go, we get to examine them. And we get to be curious about this cause and effect nature. We get to say, okay, if I say that, what might that feel like in the body, to reflect on that? Okay, and if I do that, what might that feel like in the body, to reflect on if I did that? The Buddha has this really great teaching on intention, which we're transitioning into, where he says separate your thoughts into two types of thoughts. Thoughts of reactivity and thoughts of response. He says, and whenever a thought arises, pause for a moment and reflect. What type of thought is this? If I act on this thought, what will happen next? And if you recognize that that thought will lead to your welfare and happiness, then you should follow it. He says, and if you recognize that that thought would lead in the opposite to more stress and more suffering, then you should abandon it. Right? It's like the Buddha's like a CBT therapist almost. Right? But he had this wonderful tool of mindfulness. And this was 2,600 years ago. Pretty cool. So how do we know the right thing to do from, an option from this practice of mindfulness in this perspective of the Dharma and wise view and wise intention? One way that we know the right thing to do is we slow down and we don't act on the first impulse, we recognize it. And we recognize it and then we allow it to be there. We don't try to fight against it or blame ourselves for having it or judging and thinking, oh, why do I want to punch this person in the face? I'm such an angry person. We just say, oh, there's the feeling that I want to punch this person in the face. Nice. Welcome, anger. And we don't act on it and we slow down. So we allow it and we investigate it. We say, this is interesting, okay? I wonder if there's anything under this. Right? Where do I feel this in my body? We get curious. We get interested. Right? We're not trying to get conceptual and figure out the emotion. Have you ever noticed you can't really figure out an emotion? It's a whole different language. It's like, this is what I love about being a therapist. People come in, they're feeling their feelings. They're like, all right, so what do I do next? I'm like, I guess just feel whatever feeling comes next. And it's like we never want that to be the answer, but it's like if you recognize and allow it, then we can start to investigate and just stay curious about the emotion. Because you can't figure it out right away. Patience is a big part of mindfulness. And we stay curious and then we can practice over time some non-attachment. And this is the last piece that I want to talk about with intention is when we make a decision, there's no such thing as a right decision. There's a wise intention. There's a, for lack of a better word, right intention. which is, have I slowed down? Have I allowed it? Have I investigated it? Have I asked myself, well, what would it feel like if I did this? What would I feel like if it did that? And if I've done that, I still have this fear. Well, what if it still ends badly? What if that person gets mad? What if I still lose this opportunity? What if that person on the date doesn't like me if I tell them this thing about me? What if? And then we get to really illuminate how much of our reactivity is fear-based. And there's this aspect, I call it the other F word, faith. There's this aspect of Buddhism doesn't give us an option for things working out. It tells us the truth. It says, we know what's going to happen. You're going to get old, get sick, and die. And that's not actually a problem. Buddhism dramatically changes this idea of things working out and says, everything is impermanent, and that's not a problem. So you don't have to figure it out. There's no thing that you get at the end of this long road. You get to be in this moment, and that's such a gift. And you get a lot of these. At least right now, you get a lot of these. In this moment, a lot of breaths. And that if you reflect on what is a kind way to be in this moment, what is a wise way to be in this moment, what is a compassionate way to be in this moment, that you can't actually make a wrong choice. You can have dukkha. You can have people that still get mad at you. You will still make mistakes. You can still cause harm. You can be very reflective and still cause harm. And you can stupidly cause harm. You can be very reflective with every ounce. I mean, it's going to happen a lot less. But if you can have every ounce of reflection, and then you hurt someone and they say, ouch. And then you have an opportunity to say, oh my gosh, I used to act like that. And I thought that was kindness. I found out that was codependence. Damn it. You know when you have these kind of awakenings and you're like, man, I used to think I was so kind, but I was just very codependent. Or whatever it may be. I used to thought I was very brutally honest, and I found out I was just brutal. People told me I was very mean. I thought I was having fun with my friends, and people told me I was, sarcastic or hurtful with my words. So the outcome is secondary to my heartfelt intention. And you don't have to think about it this way, so I'm just putting on my hat of an opinion, just because this is how I think of things. But I think, for me, the reason why this started to feel, or one of the reasons why this started to feel okay with me, that the outcome was secondary to my intention, is that I noticed that the more I was curious in my motivation behind why I was doing something, the more my actions aligned. And the more that I was curious in my intention behind doing something, the less my mind inclined towards doing harmful things. Does that make sense? I noticed kind of this law of karma in action, which was that the more I practiced trying to be kind, the more I was looking for opportunities to be kind. Does that make sense? And this doesn't also mean, one of the things I also found is that I don't lose wisdom in the process of focusing on intention. If I'm being honest with myself, I'm still paying attention to if I cause harm. I'm still trying to not cause harm with every fiber of my body. I'm not just aimlessly saying, well, I intended it this way. As a practitioner of mindfulness, I'm really trying to be honest about my intentions. Because let's be real, anytime I've been like, oh, that's not what I meant, I wasn't really looking at my intention. I was just joking. So wisdom isn't lost for me when I'm really looking at my motivation behind what I'm doing. And the same goes for other people in my life. You know, someone can have really great intentions, but my experience is over time they've continued to do the same thing that hurts. And that doesn't mean I just endlessly give them a break. I say, no, part of my intention is self-compassion. So that hurts and it keeps hurting, and so I'm going to practice some renunciation here and let go or give some space to this relationship or set some boundaries. Right? So I guess what I'm saying is that examining our intention is a tool. There's not one way that it plays out. Does that make sense? And it includes and always has as a basis an interest in wisdom. We take the outcome and we learn. And so the Buddha offers, just for some map, making the right decision. We're born into a world that's transient. It's inherently vulnerable. What we have is an ability to show up in the moment with curiosity and look at how we want to respond to that moment, knowing that we can't really control the outcome, but paying attention to the outcome so we can be skillful moving forward and learn. And then how do we act skillfully, right? Like, what are some good markers? A lot of these we already know. Like, these are universal spiritual principles. They're really humanistic principles. Being kind and compassionate, not harming others, not stealing from others, right? And Buddhism has these too. The cool thing about how they're presented in this practice is they're called training precepts. So they're not like rules. They're guiding principles that we can guide our intentions with that generally tend to work out pretty good a lot of the times. But they're situational, right? Like, you know, I'm trying to think of an example, but I know we all have many. Like, one is like kindness and niceness. Like, being kind, I can be kind and say what I mean without being mean when I say it, but I can still say what I mean. But sometimes my brain interprets saying what I mean as being mean. And then I have to like re-examine, like, did I say anything mean? Was I short? No, I said, no, that's not okay with me. It's like, actually, I didn't say anything mean. So these principles guide us. And I may say, okay, I want to be kind, but my understanding of what kindness is the point. Right? It helps me examine my relationship to kindness. Does this make sense? It goes back to that lens thing that's kind of tricky about, it's subtle about Buddhism. So 3 intentions, one of them actually is kindness. The other 2 are renunciation and compassion. So these are kind of 3 guiding principles. Renunciation is this intention of looking at when our mind says, I need more, pausing, reflecting, and looking at, is this a desire that comes from a place of feeling full, or is this a craving that comes from a place of feeling empty? You know, is this this demanding feeling of filling this void, to get something, to have something? Or actually, can I practice renunciation? Say, I really like that, and it would feel pleasant for me, and it's been harmful for me, and maybe someone else could use it, and whatever, fill in the blank. Practicing renunciation is this practice of looking at when we don't really need anything extra to add to the experience, and how much of our mind is always trying to make the experience a little bit better. And for me, this is a big part of my experience. It's like, this moment's great, and it would be even better if I had a pint of ice cream right now. You know, it's like I'll be sitting on vacation, literally, like in the sun, on the beach, like, what do you want? My family's healthy, laughing. I'm like, damn it, my phone just died. I'm like, wait a second, do I really need that, right? Practicing this renunciation. The second intention is metta, or loving kindness. And one reason why I wanted to mention this is because loving kindness in this tradition is taught as an antidote to fear. And so this isn't actually just kindness towards other people, although it's actually towards all beings. The Buddha says it's appropriate in every experience to have kindness, a mind filled with kindness. And that includes towards ourselves. I think a lot of times when I'm reactive and making decisions, it's because there's a fear. And how helpful it's been to be able to tell myself, I know you're afraid and I'll love you no matter what happens. I know that you're trying your best no matter what happens. And just how nice it can be to give myself permission to not have to have something work out, but to be willing to take that risk sometimes. Because sometimes it's about not being as greedy, renunciation, but sometimes it's also about not being so cautious and withdrawn from life. And that's fear. Right? And so metta really helps me to actually step up sometimes and say, I know this is scary to say this thing or to take this risk or to do this thing, and may I be at ease with this fear as I walk through this discomfort. And last but not least is the intention of compassion. And compassion's a very beautiful quality of the heart and very tricky, because again, it's about learning our lens. And how do we balance, I think one of the areas I wanted to talk about with this, where it's hard to make a decision, is I've noticed when people in my life are struggling, like, how can I support people while also not losing my capacity? Managing my capacity. If you've ever, I know a lot of people in here, helping professions, like if you've ever experienced burnout, it's very real. And I find that to be when I've kind of lost awareness of my capacity. And it's usually been well-intended, right? Like I really cared, and I can actually put up with a lot more than my mind sometimes thinks I can. And then I've tested the limits of that, and I've also gone too far in the other direction. And so remember, it's about the lens, and it's about also just continually checking in with our intention, because there's no line, right? Does it mean a friend calls for help and they're down and out? Can you help them? Yeah. Well, should you? That's a hard thing to answer. We can only answer that for ourselves, right? And so I just thought this was interesting reflection around compassion. We'll close. Ajahn Chah is kind of talking about this near enemy of compassion, and how we sometimes want to do no harm all the time, to a degree where we forget that we also are balancing that intention, that beautiful intention of compassion, with powerlessness and this vulnerability. And so he has this really simple teaching, I've heard this before, about a monk that came to him on a meditation retreat and said, well, what do I do about, we're not supposed to kill, but sometimes I'm stepping on ants. Right? So it's kind of a good teaching on someone being afraid of causing harm to ants. And Ajahn Chah is this wonderful Buddhist teacher in the Thai forest tradition who has since passed. But he said, keep your mindfulness sharp. In activity around the monastery, the important point is intention. Know what you are doing and know how you feel about it. Learn to know the mind that clings. Learn to also know the mind that clings to ideas of purity and bad karma, burdens itself with doubt and excessive fear of wrongdoing. This too is attachment. Too much of this mind makes you afraid to sweep because you may kill ants, afraid to walk because you may harm the grass. New doubts constantly arise in regard to one's purity. If you keep following the anxiety, you only gain temporary relief. You must understand the process of doubt in order to put an end to it. It's a really beautiful teaching that Ajahn Chah is offering, a way that I often don't think about compassion, which is how I kind of get attached to not wanting to cause harm, to a degree where I don't engage, actually. And how a lot of times, how complex it is, like Cody said, how complex it is, right? I'll leave it at that.
What's up, y'all? Reverend Mikey Noshel here from Wild Heart Meditation Center in Nashville, Tennessee. Thanks for checking us out. Do me a favor, please like and subscribe. And if you feel moved to leave a donation, you can do so at wildheartmeditationcenter.org or the Venmo link in the description. Peace and love.